Para mí, el is also talking in progress. Que es un gusto tenerlos aquí, porque en esta ocasión de pensar, reflexionar y celebrar los 100 años de la Escuela de Frankfurt, es realmente un privilegio el contar aquí con nosotros a Martin Jay, que es sin duda alguna, sino el principal, uno de los grandes teóricos de la Escuela de Frankfurt y el pensamiento crítico. Unas palabras antes de dar inicio a la presentación del Dr. Jay y de la conferencia de hoy. ¿Cómo surgió esta idea? Nosotros hace muchos años ya, cuando celebramos el aniversario de la muerte de Marcuse, invitamos al profesor Jay a la facultad. Desde entonces él ha sido invitado por muchas instituciones y ha venido a México. Ahora surgió lo siguiente, que nos acompaña también María Pía Lara de la Universidad Autónoma de la UAM, la Metropolitana, me llama y me dice que acaba de invitar al profesor Jay a México, ya que lo había invitado a Praga, pero él no pudo ir, y me ofrece que celebremos juntos este aniversario, y me pareció que para nosotros era espléndido. Hablé inmediatamente con la directora de la facultad, la doctora Carola García Calderón, con la doctora Karla Valverde, que es la coordinadora del posgrado, y acordamos que era excelente la idea de hacer esta aventura de un modo conjunto. Entonces, el día de hoy iniciamos aquí y el jueves tendremos la segunda conferencia tal como el anuncio que hemos planteado presenta. Tal vez permítanme 2 palabras y luego le voy a pedir una intervención a María Pía para que nos diga por qué nos conmovió tanto este evento conjunto de los 100 años. Creo que quienes están aquí, profesores, colegas, alumnos, saben bien de la obra y la trayectoria del profesor Jay. Creo que es uno de los académicos, pensadores, intelectuales más destacado en el pensamiento, en la historia intelectual, en la historia, en la historia de la cultura y sus contribuciones a la teoría crítica, no solo en la interpretación, sino también en los aportes nuevos de cómo pensar en este momento o en el siglo XXI también, y también un autor cuyos aportes conciernen a la filosofía de la historia y tiene pues una influencia muy destacada en el mundo académico de Estados Unidos, de Europa, de América Latina, y yo espero que en sus clases de español pueda seguir lo que estoy diciendo. Bueno, ha impartido, él está, como ustedes bien saben, en la Universidad en Berkley. Él ha sido destacado en su docencia, en su investigación y también en las actividades editoriales de los principales órganos del pensamiento de la teoría crítica. Ha sido profesor visitante de las principales universidades en el mundo, obviamente entre ellas la UNAM, en un papel destacado, ¿no? Eh, eh, bueno, su acercamiento, su aproximación crítica a la teoría crítica se ha manifestado en muchísimos campos y líneas de investigación y ha tenido, creo yo, una aproximación muy integral, muy integrativa también de cómo este pensamiento interactúa con la realidad y va conformando diferentes momentos de la vida, vamos a decir, del pensamiento y de la reflexión. Bueno, también dentro de este campo, los estudios que tienen que ver con las cuestiones de política, ética, memoria, identidad, todo ello forma parte de su abundante producción. Abundante es poco decir, es una larga lista de libros que ha publicado y que son de conocimiento de todos ustedes. Estaría yo realmente pecando de solo mencionar algunos, pero desde los años 70, que publica su ya tan conocida la imaginación dialéctica, que es cuando es una historia de la escuela de Frankfurt, primero como su tesis doctoral, luego como libro, comienza una profusa investigación, ha merecido los premios más destacados y también debo decirles que hemos tenido el privilegio de contar con un trabajo suyo en aquel número que la revista de la facultad publicó sobre el 1968, ¿correcto? A los 50 años. Entonces, pues es realmente un gusto tenerlo con nosotros y le voy a pedir a María Pía entonces que comparta con nosotros el porqué, la relevancia y cómo nos llevó a estar juntos en este intercambio, en esta colaboración. Por favor.
Bueno, primero que nada, gracias a la Universidad Autónoma, a UNAM, es mi casa donde yo estudié mi licenciatura. Muchas gracias a Judit y a Karla por habernos permitido recorrer esta invitación que originalmente profesor Jay aceptó cuando yo le dije que, sabiendo que no había ido él, que no aceptaba ir a Praga para los 100 años en el centenario en aniversario de la escuela de la teoría crítica, yo pensé que a lo mejor viviendo más cerca de México, a México, él aceptaría y me dijo inmediatamente que sí. Y desde luego después me dijo que quería hacer una conferencia con la doctora Judit Bokser, porque tenía una excelente memoria de la visita que hizo aquí, gracias a ella. Así que...
Y también porque había oído, Martín, que en México también por las calles había un golem caminando. Si no fue a Praga, right? You heard that here.
Have a golem. Pero quiero decir una parte, digamos, autobiográfica aquí. Cuando yo entré a la Facultad de Filosofía y Letras, el libro La imaginación dialéctica estaba publicado en español en la editorial Taurus, pero estaba agotado. Era un libro que solo nos podíamos hacer fotocopias para poderlo leer, porque el libro estaba agotado. El profesor Martí, que entonces era un joven y esa fue la tesis, conoció en persona a todos los fundadores, a Max Horkheimer, a Adorno, a Theodor Adorno, a Herbert Marcuse, con el que fue colega en la Universidad de Berkley, y además pudo entrevistarlos. Y de eso trataba el libro de la imaginación dialéctica, que los invito, porque ahora ya no está agotado, los invito a que puedan ustedes conocer el origen de la historia, de cómo se fundó, de quiénes fueron, de cuáles eran sus preocupaciones en el momento que Marie decidió buscar esta reconstrucción histórica de esta importante tradición que quiere ser interdisciplinaria, considera que la filosofía, la historia, la economía, el psicoanálisis tienen que estar entrelazados para poder aportar un conocimiento de tipo crítico, inmanente, y evidentemente en este caso esta historia de la fundación de la teoría crítica ha seguido con la talla de este historiador que es Mary J, y que en estos momentos les voy a decir algunos de los libros, casi todos traducidos. Génesis y Validez acaba de aparecer en inglés, pero está otra reconstrucción de los momentos que el libro que se llama Espina en el ojo, Splinters in Your Eye. Ese libro vuelve a recorrer algunas de las cuestiones que él se pregunta acerca de las preocupaciones vitales de Horkheimer, de Adorno, de cómo en algún momento sus propios orígenes religiosos tuvieron también algunas consecuencias en la forma teórica en la que ellos fueron presentando los problemas. Pero también Está su libro Crítica Inmanente, Reason After Its Eclipse, La razón después del eclipse, el libro que se dedica fundamentalmente a una cosa que fue el cambio transitorio de la idea de las imágenes hacia la idea de, digamos, la posmodernidad y los estudios postestructuralistas en donde la palabra y los discursos se convirtieron sustitutos de lo que antes era la imagen. Este libro se llama Downcast Eyes y está también traducido al español, ¿no? Mi favorito, que se llama Songs of Experience, la canción de la experiencia, y él quiere allí hacer una recuperación de todos los autores que han tomado el concepto de experiencia como central, desde luego el concepto para los pragmatistas americanos. Esta es la gran tradición cuyo concepto es la experiencia, ¿no? Pero lo que ha dicho Judith tiene que ver también con la importancia de que cada uno de estos trabajos ha sido una articulación histórica de problemas esenciales. Tiene un libro que ahora me parece que tiene una resonancia mucho mayor que cuando lo escribió, que se llama Las virtudes de la mendacidad. Ese es un libro sobre la mentira. Y en este momento yo creo que es importante que podamos reflexionar sobre cómo los políticos, y especialmente en Estados Unidos, han hecho de la mentira la manera de subir y de tener el poder, ¿no? O sea que para mí era esencial poder tener a alguien de la talla de este gran historiador, cuyos alumnos son también brillantes, Samuel Moyn, Peter Gordon y Walter Breckman, tenerlo el día de hoy y el día jueves a las 4 de la tarde en la Casa Rafael Galván, y darle las gracias a Judith y a Martín por haber hecho esto.
Bueno, pues ahora entonces es el turno que le pidamos a Martin J. Su presentación. Como ustedes saben, será en inglés y yo les solicito a ustedes que al finalizar, si quieren y deseamos, ¿no? Que formulen preguntas, lo pueden hacer en español y nosotros lo vamos traduciendo si es necesario. So please, Martin.
Let me first say how enormously grateful I am to be here yet again, to María Pía for initiating this visit, and for Judit for also inviting me here to UNAM. It's enormously moving to think that I first came here over 40 years ago at Judit's invitation to talk about Herbert Marcuse, who will be a figure in this talk as well. I must say that looking out at the audience is still young. The people on the panel, on the other hand. So 40 years is a long time, but it's really exciting to be back. Let me also apologize for giving this lecture in English. I really, in 40 years, should have learned Spanish, but I'm only beginning now to rectify that deficit, but not to the point where I can actually lecture in it. So I will try to be as clear and speak as slowly as possible, but I hope in the question and answer period you will ask me simply to explain if I haven't explained anything clearly. In the early winter of 1971, Herbert Marcuse visited Jerusalem as a guest of the Van Leer Foundation. In addition to his academic encounters, he requested and was granted an interview with the Israeli Defense Minister Moshe Dayan on December 29, 1971. They discussed, among other things, possible negotiations between Israel and Egypt in the aftermath of the Six-Day War, a two-state solution to the conflict based on an Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories, and the chances of a new violent conflict unless Israel did so. Marcuse solicited from Moshe Dayan an admission that Israel had originally seized land that belonged to the Palestinians, but admitted in turn that in the recent war, Israel did, and I'm quoting Marcuse, nothing wrong in defending its very existence. In passing, Marcuse expressed concern about the possible assassination of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat, should there be only a partial withdrawal from the Sinai Peninsula, a prediction that alas soon came true. Now, I begin with this anecdote, not to revisit the troubled history of the Middle East in the past half century, or at least not primarily for that reason, but rather to foreground the highly symbolic nature of the unusual encounter between Herbert Marcuse, the iconic figure of the New Left, who inspired, as no one else, the student-led unrest of 1968, and Moshe Dayan, the military hero of the decisive Israeli victory in the war that took place only a year earlier. And in so doing, I want to signal my belief that we need to expand our understanding of the meaning of 1968 to include the seemingly distinct events that transpired in the Middle East the previous year. In so doing, we can also enrich our understanding of the critical theorists' fraught relationship to the German New Left and their differing response to post-colonial struggles. Only, in fact, by exploring the Frankfurt School's response to the Six-Day War and more generally to the Palestinian cause as a putative placeholder for third world anti-imperialist struggles, only by exploring their response can we, I think, make sense of the meaning of 1968 now more than a half century later, and what now seems its relative importance in the drama of global history since then. Now, in a conventional sense, to be sure, 1968 has already been situated in temporally and spatially expanded contexts. Historians often argue that its starting point should really be put more or less in 1960, when the left wing of the Socialist German Student Union, the SDS, broke from the Social Democratic Party, the SPD. What is sometimes called the long 1960s are understood to have ended only perhaps in 1977 and the so-called German Autumn, which led to the turn away from violent struggle symbolized by the collapse of the Red Army faction and the acceptance of electoral politics by the nascent Green Party. In spatial terms, the generational rebellion or political rupture that has come to be identified with the year 1968 has been cited rather in no fewer than 39 different countries in the world, with the major outbreaks located in the United States, France, Italy, Japan, and of course here in Mexico. Unrest in the Soviet bloc, especially in Czechoslovakia and Poland, has also been understood as part of the larger story. Without situating the German case in the international context of what has been called the global 60s, it has seemed impossible to understand how heavily influenced it was by cultural and political trends from the outside. Now, both of these expansions implicitly, however, posit an essential coherence, either as a diachronic narrative, a temporal narrative, or as a unified synchronic comparison. In the temporal narrative, the story of 68 is told as a cumulative emergence of transgressive forces that reached a crisis in that year, but then lost its momentum and sputtered into relative impotence a decade later. Although the maximalist, at times defiantly utopian goals of the student movement are acknowledged to have been thwarted, much was changed, it's normally argued, in the political cultures and social mores of the countries where it was most active. The new left may have never come to power, that's true, but the old left was largely delegitimated, while the rise of new social movements such as feminism, gay rights, ecological activism was accelerated. Although abandoned well before it reached its ultimate goal, the long march through the institutions is credited with leaving important reforms in its wake. And as Tiananmen Square, the Occupy movement, and the Arab Spring show, there were also later echoes of some of the mass protest tactics developed by the student movement, albeit in the last two instances with new features aided by the changed social media landscape of the 21st century. In the case of the spatial expansion, The German 68 has come to be understood as part of a worldwide phenomenon, produced in part by common stimuli such as opposition to the Vietnam War and generational discontent with outdated university constraints, but also spread by mimetic contagion. Although national variations are, of course, acknowledged, the common forms of struggle adopted in various countries and the emphasis on youthful, often utopian activism are understood to transcend boundaries. As with temporal expansion, there too, a more or less unified, coherent account results, which stresses the fruitful exchanges and mutual reinforcement that occurred across national boundaries. Perhaps only 1848, which saw unrest in many European countries without full success in any, only 1848 has been seen as comparable in its international scope to 1968. What the symbolic juxtaposition of Herbert Marcuse and Moshe Dayan suggests, however, is something different, is that another concept of an expanded field is possible now that a half century has passed, one that is, I think, less coherent, less harmonious than the ones that I've just described. Positing the stereoscopic or parallax quality of our hindsight, it resists the urge to come into focus as a singular three-dimensional vision. Although the familiar notion of a force field or constellation introduced by Walter Benjamin and adopted by Adorno is one inspiration for this alternative, another, I want to argue, is a celebrated essay by the American art critic, Rosalind Krauss, an essay called Sculpture in the Expanded Field, which was first published in 1979. Drawing on the site-specific work of Robert Smithson and Robert Morris, she challenges the traditional notion of a sculpture. She writes, "The logic of sculpture, it would seem, is inseparable from the logic of the monument. By virtue of this logic, a sculpture is a commemorative representation. It sits in a particular place and speaks in a symbolic tongue about the meaning of that place," end quote. Such traditional sculptures are normally figurative, normally vertical, normally separated from the surrounding site by the intervention of a pedestal, which functions in a way a frame does around the painting to set the object apart. But in the late 19th century, Rosalind Krauss argues, the traditional notion of sculpture began to erode as the mediating function of the pedestal diminished, and the object lost its representational character, no longer an inert monument, but increasingly a self-referential abstraction. Rather than having a positive content, it entered what she calls its, quote, negative condition, a kind of sitelessness or homelessness, an absolute loss of place. If it could be defined at all, it was more in terms of what it was not, which was preeminently architecture and landscape, than what it was. Now, the details of Roz Krauss's argument, which draw on mathematical transformations and decline groups and structural semiotics, these need not detain us now. What's important to register is the implications of her argument for expanding an integral object, apparently integral, into what she calls a universe of terms that are felt to be in opposition within a cultural situation. What disrupts traditional notions of sculpture may also work for historical dates that have been turned into inert monuments, no longer capable of serving as a nodal point of a single coherent narrative or as a marker for parallel events across national borders. 1968, I want to argue, 1968 is best understood in a kind of expanded field with 1967. Juxtaposed rather than reconciled, they can only be brought together in a dynamic field of conflicting forces still in play, still now, even after a half century has passed. Reminiscent of Ernst Bloch's notion of non-synchronicity, the German is Ungleichzeitigkeit, but without his faith in the ultimate reconciliation of temporal contradictions, such an approach alerts us to the relativization of what seemed to be a punctual moment, 1968, in a single historical space-time continuum. To understand the role of the Frankfurt School in the German 68 is therefore also to situate its history in the expanded field that includes what seemed to be the very different events of 1967, which resist incorporation into a unified single narrative. It's to register the importance of 67 in generating its negative relationship to aspects of the German 68 and in coloring its attitude, the Frankfurt School's attitude towards post-colonial struggles and the discourse they have spawned. By expanding the field in this way, we'll avoid turning 68 into a kind of isolated monument on a pedestal that masks its connection to the multiple historical contexts that can set it in motion and help us understand its continuing importance today. Now, before attempting to articulate what we mean by this expanded field, we have to acknowledge that the magnetic push and pull of 67, and I'm using it broadly to mean the turmoil in the Middle East, was not entirely lost on the protagonists of 68. That is, we have to remember that on June 2nd, 1967, less than a week before the outbreak of the Six-Day War, Benno Ohnesorg, a German student, was killed by a policeman in a demonstration protesting the visit of the Shah of Iran. The radicalization of the student movement accelerated and intensified by the outrage of the murder was thus intimately entangled with unfolding events in the Middle East, an entanglement that only increased with the bitterly divided response of the movement to the Israeli victory in the war. We might say that prior to the Six-Day War, the West German left, as might be expected in the aftermath of the Holocaust, the West German left was hesitant to criticize Israel and its role as a refuge for persecuted Jews. But once the existential threat to Israel seemed to have passed, and the problematic occupation of Palestinian lands solidified, this taboo was essentially lifted. And the shift became explicit, it's sometimes argued, when a resolution proposed by the great novelist Günter Grass at an SDS meeting to support the state of Israel's right to exist, when this resolution was defeated. Now, although the degree of East German involvement in that process is still much debated, the anti-Zionist stance of the Soviet bloc seems to have had an impact in reinforcing anti-imperialist sentiments on the German left, which often embraced the Palestinian cause with special gusto. What is not, alas, at issue is the troubling tendency of certain anti-imperialist, anti-Zionist, and anti-American militants to draw on traditional anti-Semitic prejudices in their zeal to defend that cause. Perhaps the most blatant of these was Dieter Kunzelmann, who emerged from the German wing of the Situationists, they were called the Spür, to become a leading figure in the Kommune 1, which was a collective group in Berlin, and an outspoken critic of what he called the philo-Semitic Judenknacks, which means Jewish neurosis, that induced post-war Germany to pay reparations to Israel. Because the Israeli cause was supported by the American government and the Springer press in West Germany, it was easy for Kunzelmann and his ilk to see it as a pillar of the hated status quo. Now, at the fringes of what became known as the extra-parliamentary movement in German, the APO, were groups that matched rhetoric with action, including in certain cases lethal violence. Among the most notorious of these was the West Berlin Tupamaros, named after the Uruguayan guerrillas, a group to which Dieter Kunzelmann belonged. After some of their members went to an Al-Tafah training camp for terrorists in Jordan, they attempted to bomb the West Berlin Jewish Community Center on November 9th, 1969, which is, I'm sure you know, is the anniversary of Kristallnacht, and also desecrated monuments to victims of the Holocaust. This destructive alliance culminated in the participation of two German radicals, Wilfried Bose and Brigitte Kuhlmann, in the hijacking of the Air France flight that was forced to land in Entebbe, Uganda in July 1976. They were killed in the Israeli raid that rescued the hostages, with Kuhlmann in particular gaining added notoriety for the vicious way she seems to have singled out Jewish passengers with special treatment. This has been somewhat disputed in the literature since, but basically was understood to have been the case, at least at the time. An even more explicit example of the radical German left's openness to the siren call of anti-Semitism was the lawyer and one-time Red Army faction member Horst Mahler, who passed through a Maoist phase to become a member of the far-right National Democratic Party of Germany in 2000. An outspoken Holocaust denier, he was ultimately convicted and served a lengthy prison sentence for incitement to popular hatred. Now, much more can be said about the tangled relationship between the fringe elements of the German New Left, anti-Zionism, and anti-Semitism, a relationship that has haunted German politics, for many years to come. Joschka Fischer, who even became the German foreign minister, had to explain his embarrassing presence at a PLO conference in Algeria in 1969. But what I want to do now is to ask, what was the role of the Frankfurt School in this tangled web? There were, it seems, echoes of Marcuse's ideas about sexual liberation, along with those of Wilhelm Reich, in Dieter Kunzelmann's thinking. And some readers of Horkheimer and Adorno's Dialektik der Aufklärung, Dialectic of Enlightenment, claimed that it basically had been used to exculpate the specific German responsibility for the Holocaust in the name of a broader critique of Western civilization. But by and large, the direct impact of critical theory on the anti-authoritarian movement's problematic conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism, the direct impact was minimal. The most outspoken critic of Zionism, it turns out, in the first generation of members was Erich Fromm, the psychoanalyst Erich Fromm, who had no use for nationalism of any kind. Instead, Fromm remained true to the ideal of a binational secular state advocated by Judah Magnus and the Brit Shalom movement in the interwar era. But Fromm, of course, had long since severed his ties with his former colleagues at the Institute for Social Research, and his critique of Zionism played scarcely any role in the anti-authoritarian movement in Germany and its struggle to operationalize critical theory. The other members of the Frankfurt School all shared Marcuse's post-Holocaust anxiety over the threat to a safe haven for Jews in a world that had so recently spurned them. However much they may have criticized specific Israeli policies towards the Palestinians, however much they may have bemoaned the blunting of the messianic potential of Judaism in the creation of a normal modern state, they had no qualms about defending its right to exist. In fact, in 1956, during the Suez Crisis, Horkheimer and Adorno had called the Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser a, quote, fascist chieftain who conspires with Moscow, end quote, and added that the Arab states, quote, have been on the lookout for years for an opportunity to fall upon Israel and to slaughter the Jews who have found refuge there, end quote. As Jack Jacob notes in his book on the Frankfurt School and the Jewish question, Horkheimer's continuing doubts about the Jewish state had nothing in common with anti-Zionism. Horkheimer was well aware that purported anti-Zionism provided a thin screen both for the neo-Nazis, such as those writing in the late 1960s for the Deutsche Nationalzeitung, and for communists in Eastern Europe. Likewise, Adorno expressed support for Israel during the 6 Days War. Intermingling remarks on the death of Benno Onozorg in a lecture he gave on aesthetics with references, quote, to the terrible threat to Israel, the refuge of countless Jews who have fled a horrifying fate. The same attitude continued into the second generation of the Frankfurt School, as demonstrated by Jürgen Habermas's frequent visits to Israel, beginning with a trip in 1977 to celebrate the 80th birthday of Gershom Scholem. Thus, despite the German New Left's tilt towards the Palestinians and against Zionism, which all too often opened the doors to latent or even manifest expressions of anti-Semitism, there would seem to be little to justify expanding the field of 68 to include 67, in any account that stresses critical theory's role in its inspiration. If, however, we step back from the specific issues raised by the overlap or lack thereof between the German New Left's attitude toward Zionism and the Frankfurt School's fidelity to the idea of a safe haven for the world's Jews, there is, I think, much more to the symbolic meaning of the encounter between Marcuse and Moshe Dayan in wider terms that do, I would argue, justify expanding the field of 68 to include 67. For remember, as Rosalind Krauss argues, expanded fields also include oppositions and negations, as well as positive reinforcements. Now, I'm referring here to what might be seen as the Frankfurt School's relative indifference to events outside of the American and European context they had experienced at first hand, or more precisely, about their skepticism about the redemptive role often assigned anti-imperialist movements outside the West, such as the Palestinian cause. And this, in a way, is the sort of center of gravity of my argument here. They're often attacked by people who say, well, they were indifferent to third world liberation struggles. I'm trying to do in this paper to give you some context to explain and maybe even justify that relative indifference. Now, to be sure, when the Institute had been founded back in the 1920s, the inclusion of the Marxist sinologist Karl August Wittfogel signaled an interest in that wider world. But in time, Wittfogel, who had been a staunch communist in the interwar era and became a right-wing anti-communist after the war, was increasingly marginalized. As for Latin America, although Felix Weil, who was the founder of the Institute financially, moved back and forth from Buenos Aires to New York during the Institute's exile, and in fact wrote a book called Argentine Riddle in 1944, it was not considered a product of the Institute's work and had no echo in the thinking of its members. Now, the relative indifference of the Frankfurt School to events outside of their own orbit has often been lamented. And in a recent book titled Left-Wing Melancholia, the Italian intellectual historian who now teaches at Cornell in America, Enzo Traverso, sees it exemplified in what he calls the mixed dialogue between Adorno and the Afro-Cuban cultural critic and novelist C.L.R. James, the mixed dialogue and failed encounter between Adorno and C.L.R. James. Now, who is James? Perhaps best remembered for his pioneering study of the Haitian Revolution, Black Jacobins. James, along with W.E.B. Du Bois, Eric Williams, and Stuart Hall, was one of the leading figures in what has come to be called the tradition of Black Marxism. Although he and Adorno actually met for several meals on several occasions when both were in exile in New York in the 1940s, neither seems to have taken much away from their time together. James, at the time a Trotskyist, aligned with Trotsky's former secretary, Raya Dunayevskaya, and the so-called Johnson Forrest tendency of the Socialist Workers' Party, was introduced to Adorno by Marcuse, who along with Fromm was to maintain an extended correspondence with Dunayevskaya in the following decades, and this has now been published. Insofar as James and Dunayevskaya shared the analysis of the Soviet Union as an example of state capitalism rather than genuine socialism, insofar as they shared that with Friedrich Pollock, the chances for real dialogue might have seemed auspicious. But Adorno and James differed in two fundamental ways. First, whereas Adorno had given up on the proletariat as the vanguard of revolution and had no interest in the anti-colonial struggles then still largely on the horizon, James was enough of an optimist to believe that revolution led by the working class was still historically possible. Rather than seeing the dialectic of enlightenment as a dark story of domination and decline, he still held out hopes for struggle and resistance. Secondly, James did not entirely share Adorno's disdain for the culture industry as inherently conformist. Now, one can go on about the differences and the perhaps similarities. In the years to come, James would be turned into a founding figure in subaltern and post-colonial studies, while the Frankfurt School played only a minor role in their development. We might legitimately ask, Enzo Traverso concludes, we might ask whether such a misdialogue was not the symptom of a colonial unconscious of critical theory, at least in the early Frankfurt School. Now, Traverso's argument, his complaint is not without some merit. The leaders of the Frankfurt School offered, for example, no serious response to earlier episodes in the decolonization process, such as the Algerian War. But it's not clear exactly how taking on board C.L.R. James's approach would have done much to compensate for the alleged Eurocentrism of critical theory and their pessimism about the chances for radical change. Although it might have focused more attention on the issues raised by the ongoing struggle against colonial rule and its racist legacy, insofar as James remained a Leninist, it's hard to say his belief in the vanguard Workers' Party would have helped them to overcome their often lamented political deficit, the notorious gap between the theory and practice that Marxism insisted must be united. Moreover, to the extent that James shared in the romanticization of third world liberation struggles as viable alternatives to inadequate revolutionary activism in the first world, his political wager, we might say, on redemption coming from the periphery rather than the center of the world system of global capitalism, his wager does not look, I'm afraid, at least from our current vantage point, to have been carried out. However justifiable it certainly is to condemn the evils of European imperialism and include the often disastrous interventions of the United States in that lament, it is not clear that liberation from colonial rule has produced models of political and economic emancipation that the rest of the world should hasten to follow. In fact, already in Minima Moralia, Adorno had sounded the tocsin, had sounded the alarm. In an aphorism entitled, quote, "Savages are not more noble," he insisted that an uncompromising mind, that is to say, a critical mind, is the very opposite of primitivism, neophytism, that means just being a newcomer, or the non-capitalist world. It presupposes, Adorno says, experience, an historical memory, a fastidious intellect, and above all, an ample measure of satiety, an ample measure of being already gratified, being already, in a way, satisfied. Because colonized people so often seek to catch up with the West and to share the alleged fruits of modern society, he argued, their aspirations are more likely to affirm rather than negate its repressive features. He writes, instead of expecting miracles of the pre-capitalist peoples, older nations should be on their guard against their unimaginative, indolent taste for everything proven and for the, quote, successes of the West. Now, there's a lot to, be concerned with in his language here. And although Adorno was surely on shaky grounds in reducing the tastes of what he called pre-capitalist people to nothing but crass envy, his skepticism about the inflated role assigned them by some on the left in the developed world has not, I think, been refuted by subsequent history. If we pause for a moment to consider the legacy of the one prominent Black Marxist who was directly influenced by critical theory, the celebrated African-American activist Angela Davis, the limits of placing too much hope in Enzo Traverso's misdialogue are, I think, apparent. Angela Davis had studied philosophy with Herbert Marcuse at Brandeis University in the early 1960s and went to Frankfurt in 1966 to work with Adorno. Although she oppressed him as an astute student of Kant, they were politically at odds. She later recalled that Adorno, quote, discouraged me from seeking to discover ways of linking my seemingly discrepant interests in philosophy and social activism, and, quote, suggested that my desire to work directly in the radical movements of that period was akin to a media studies student deciding to become a radio technician, end quote. Marcuse, to be sure, vigorously did defend her decision to return to activism in the United States, where she joined the Black Panthers, an all-Black group in the Communist Party. When she was fired from her position teaching philosophy at UCLA because of her membership in the Communist Party, and was then accused of supplying guns to Black Panthers who had murdered a prison guard in helping their comrades to escape Soledad prison, Marcuse, in fact, never abandoned her. Captured after going underground, which she put on the FBI's 10 most wanted list, and tried for conspiracy to kidnap and murder, Angela Davis was ultimately acquitted in 1972. But before that outcome, an international campaign was mounted on her behalf. And it was waged with special fervor in Frankfurt, where supporters like Oscar Naik, the philosopher Oscar Naik, with whom she had studied during her year in Frankfurt, fashioned her into an example of the unfairness of American justice. A solidarity committee held mass rallies beginning in November of 1970, which culminated in a Congress held in June of 1972 with Marcuse as one of the main speakers of Congress, which attracted some 10,000 participants. The outpouring support for Davis demonstrated her potential role as a bridge between critical theory and the emerging post-colonial movement, as well as feminism and Black power. But unfortunately, her unwavering loyalty to the orthodox communist movement to which she'd been introduced by her mother as a child in Birmingham, Alabama, her mother was a Communist Party member, did little to enable that outcome. For shortly after her triumphant visit to Frankfurt, Davis went to East Berlin, where she was greeted no less warmly by Erich Honecker, who recently replaced Walter Ulbricht as the party leader and defended, to her everlasting, I think, disgrace, something she had done before, defended the Soviet bloc invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. Running on the American Communist Party ticket as vice presidential candidate alongside Gus Hall, 1980 and 1984, Angela Davis remained within the party until after the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991. Now, her reputation has, to be sure, managed in most respects to survive her dogged loyalty to the party. And she was able to emerge from her years in its thrall as an influential advocate for various progressive causes. But lost by her extended allegiance to an old left that was leaving the historical stage, was any serious possibility that she might contribute to an overcoming of the Frankfurt School's Eurocentric perspective, which would expand the field of 1968 to include the implications of 67, understood from the perspective of Enzo Traverso as a validation of third world struggles. It's thus not surprising that for a long time, post-colonial theorists took little notice of the traditional critical theory, finding more intellectual nourishment in the disparate ideas that came to be called post-structuralism. Espen Hammer, in his book Adorno and the Political, echoes the conventional wisdom when he writes, quote, with some important exceptions, Adorno seems to have been virtually oblivious to the concerns of post-colonialism, including race, discrimination, and imperialism. His blunt Eurocentrism, focused as it was on Germany and Austria in particular, predisposed him to reject, at least view with suspicion, forms of cultural expression notoriously jazz that did not fit into his own framework. Now, despite these obvious blind spots in the early Frankfurt School, some efforts have been made to enlist insights from this legacy in the service of less parochial ends. In 1995, efforts were made to enlist insights from its legacy in the service of post-colonial studies by Asha Varadarajan, an Indian-born scholar who lives in Canada, who compared the work of Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, and Adorno in a book called Exotic Parodies. More recently, the American philosophers Thomas McCarthy and Amy Allen have drawn on different moments in the multi-generational tradition of critical theory to make similar arguments. McCarthy, who is an indefatigable translator and thoughtful interpreter of Habermas's work, wrote a wide-ranging study called Race, Empire, and the Ideas of Human Development in 2009. In it, he condemns the ways in which traditional notions of modernization were indeed tainted by racist and imperialist assumptions, but holds out hope for a more enlightened version of development theory that will combine the best legacies of Eurocentric liberalism, liberal universalism, with the values of multicultural particularism. Amy Allen, in contrast, Amy Allen is far less sanguine, far less hopeful about the possibility of squaring that particular circle. In her work, The End of Progress, published in 2016, she criticizes Tom McCarthy, along with Habermas, Axel Honneth, and Rainer Forst, for maintaining an unwarranted optimism about the ability of prior developmental theories to shed their problematic Eurocentric baggage. Determined to rid critical theory of its normative foundation in Enlightenment rationalism and its implicit belief in progressive cross-cultural development, Amy Allen seeks to combine Foucault's notion of genealogy with Adorno's stress on immanent critique. The goal is a more capacious notion of what she calls meta-normative contextualism, which she thinks can include the insights of post-colonial discourse. Now, ironically, despite the limited inclusion of non-European or non-American viewpoints promoted by commentators such as Traverso and Hammer, The first generation of critical theorists, Adorno in particular, have been praised by Varadarajan and Allen for their sensitivity to the dark side of the dialectic of enlightenment, in particular its dubious models of universal progressive development. It has seemed harder, McCarthy to the contrary notwithstanding, to mobilize the second and third generations' contributions, Habermas and Honeck, for that purpose. Their nuanced defense of the normative legacy of Western thought, much as it may have been betrayed by imperialist racial practices, makes them still seem, at least for some critics, insufficiently liberated from their European origins and experiences in American exile. Well, whichever strand of the tradition is picked as most likely to escape Eurocentric parochialism, there is, I want to argue, a potential problem with any attempt to enrich the Frankfurt School's legacy and compensate it for its political deficit by infusing it with post-colonial discourse, however well-intended. And then to understand what I mean, and this is really my concluding argument, will require our returning to the importance of situating 68 in an expanded field that includes the events of 1967. Now, they can, of course, be read in different ways. From one perspective, the 6 Days War can be seen as a chapter in the Western imperialist incursion into the non-European world, an outcome of Orientalist ideology and the resistance to it on the part of its victims. And certainly this was the interpretation that allowed the pro-Palestinian wing of the German New Left to denounce Zionism so fervently as continuous to the American war in Vietnam and other examples of Western imperialism. Because the Frankfurt School did not share this interpretation, the subsequent criticism that we've encountered of its Eurocentric bias and its need to assimilate insights from post-colonial discourse may appear to be warranted. But even beyond the dangers and too quick and easy an identification of the Israelis with a colonial settler experiment, one could argue their often violent struggles to expel the British from Palestine suggested is considerably more complicated than just that. It's difficult with the hindsight of the past half century to assign the Palestinians, or for that matter, any other movement of colonial liberation, to assign them a redemptive role that would somehow simply make up for the deficiencies of Eurocentrism. Now, I hasten to add, this is not to say that colonial independence was anything but a laudable goal, or that imperialism, whether direct through political control or indirect through economic or cultural domination, is in any way defensible. What is clear is that once liberated from Western domination, the new countries in what used to be called the Third World, and now often identified with the Global South, were unable to realize the emancipatory, even utopian potential imputed to them by certain European activists. In other words, sympathizing with the plight of the wretched of the earth was one thing. Relying on them to redeem humankind was another. Mindless solidarity with something called the global left made it hard to avoid supporting regimes and movements that were anything but emancipatory. Perhaps the most telling example is the woefully misplaced investment in Chinese Maoism during the Cultural Revolution by a number of prominent French intellectuals, including Jean-Paul Sartre, Philippe Sollaire, Julia Kristeva, and Alain Badiou. French Maoists were also supporters of the Palestinian cause, or at least were until 1972, and the brutal attack by the terrorist group Black September on Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. In any event, to return to the main point of this talk, the idea of an expanded field helps us to avoid turning it into a discrete self-contained episode in history, open to being represented in heroic terms, open, we might say, to be set off on a pedestal and available for simple commemoration in a narrative redemption. In putting it into play with the 6 Days War and its effects, it alerts us to the importance of competing historical narratives, which can decenter 68 beyond the more conventional temporal and spatial expansions that I mentioned earlier. Now, to be sure, it's been possible to interpret the narrative centered on 67 as potentially compatible with the dominant image of 68 as a hopeful moment in the history of human emancipation. The latter can be seen as unleashing forces for change that might have been enriched by their integration with the comparable forces in the former that go by the name of anti-imperialist decolonialization. Here, the anti-Zionist voices in the German left, despite their sometimes deplorable mobilization of anti-Semitic prejudices can be seen maybe as part of a constellation that, despite its never really coming into fruition, held out possibilities for more fundamental challenge to the status quo. In a larger sense, the exhortation of commentators such as Enzo Traverso and Amy Allen to correct the Eurocentric bias of critical theory with lessons learned from post-colonial discourse does amplify this interpretation, which sees third world redemptive politics as a way to overcome the pessimism and political deficit of the Frankfurt School. But this interpretation is called into question if we read 67 against that grain, in the way the majority of the members of the Frankfurt School did at the time, as less a failed attempt at third world resistance to Western imperialism than as a threat to the survival of the Jewish people, only narrowly averted. Then a very different constellation emerges in an enlarged field, one in which the lingering residues of 1945, understood as the unfinished business of the fascist era, the lingering residues of 45 play a vital role. Germany, after all, more than any other locus of New Left politics, was haunted by a still unmastered past. The outrage of the student movement was fueled by a sense that the sins of their fathers had not really been worked through, both in terms of the continuity of personnel in positions of power and the full confrontation of the reasons for the rise of Nazism. And conversely, the establishment's deep anxiety over what they saw as the excesses of the New Left expressed fears that the rule of law was being trampled by radicals willing to use violence to undermine the hard-earned achievements of the post-war West German political order, thus repeating the mistakes of their Weimar predecessors. In other words, the still smoldering embers of 45 helped ignite the flames of the German version of 68. There was, however, another potential reading of the unfinished business of 45, which was alarming in a different way. Despite its qualms about specific Israeli policies, most of the members of the Frankfurt School, as we've seen, were deeply anxious about a renewal, had Israel lost the 6 Days War, of the annihilation of the Jewish people merely interrupted by the defeat of Nazism. As a result, they resisted the reading of that conflict, the simplistic reading of it, as a black and white episode in the anti-imperialist struggle for global justice, a reading which seduced many on the German left. For them, the destruction of the Jewish people was enough of a threat. Remember, 1967, 68, this is only 20 years and a few, change, we might say, 20 years after the Holocaust had ended. It prevented them from understanding the 1967 war as a legitimate continuation of that ongoing threat. Acknowledging this fear helps us to understand and perhaps even sympathize with their Eurocentric inability to invest much hope in the putatively redemptive mission of the Third World, and their hesitation before expressing unqualified solidarity with the global left. It allows us to see the failure of Adorno's lunches, we might say, with C.L.R. James to create an alliance of critical theory and post-colonial discourse, see those lunches and their failure, well, is not so lamentable after all. Now, from our perspective, the perspective of more than a half century later, the issues raised by the Six-Day War and its aftermath are, of course, anything but resolved, and both sides in the conflict seem hopelessly locked in the struggle without end. But one thing I think is clear: it's impossible to summon the confidence that was once invested by post-colonial discourse with its halo of political righteousness in that particular struggle. The lingering hope that the stalled European revolution would somehow be jump-started by those hitherto oppressed peoples who are finally asserting their place in the historical stage seems, at least in this juncture, unrealized. There may have been Maoist enthusiasts of the Cultural Revolution who looked to the China of those years for answers, but the country that is now becoming the most powerful engine of global capitalism is anything but a beacon of emancipation. And I think similar appraisals, and we may differ about some of them in particular, but similar appraisals can be made of the once shining future of the Latin American left, as well as the hopes placed in national liberation struggles in China and Africa, and not to mention the Arab Spring of only a few years ago. In other words, to return to that encounter in Jerusalem in which we began. It now seems clear that the historical shadow cast by Herbert Marcuse as the embodiment of the idealistic student movement, as the embodiment of a narrative of progressive redemption, that the shadow cast by Marcuse has been much shorter and less pervasive, we might say, than that cast by Moshe Dayan, the master of nationalist realpolitik and the art of war. Or to stay with our master metaphor, the gravitational pull of 68 in its expanded field has not had the power of other talismanic years in the historical calendar. These would not only include 1967 and 1945, whose unfinished business, understood in various ways, was especially potent in Germany, but also our year, also 2023. For any historical field, must take into account the present as a moment that helps to define how we understand what came before, either as a possible future that was actually realized, or one that was thwarted or even ironically reversed. And it now seems that a line of force, we might say, that could be drawn from 67 to 2023 crackles with more energy, for good or for ill, than that between 1968 and the present. But before ending on too sour a note, it would also be prudent to remember that our own present moment, 2023, will itself fade into the past as the untotalized field of history continues relentlessly to expand. And new narratives, both complementary and contradictory, vie for supremacy. For all we know, the Frankfurt School's controversial strategy of hibernation, as Jürgen Habermas called it, the strategy of hibernation, which involved throwing messages in the bottles that were supposed to be washed up on new shores, and the relative gravitational pull of 67 over 68, these may be reversed by events yet unforeseen. It may, in other words, be best to wait for the centenary of 68 to assess such conjectures. What cannot be doubted, to be sure, is that the ever-evolving tradition of critical theory will have much to chew on in the interim. Thanks very much for your attention.
It's okay here. Thank you very much, Martin. It is okay. Microphone. Yeah, we'll put it here. Thank you very much, Martin. I think it's a brilliant approach, brilliant analysis. Still, okay. I don't think it's now my turn to add more than what you said, just to let the people to internalize. But there are 2-3 comments that I want to highlight. First, we'll take care with you just to share some of the works of Martin J. regarding this reflection on 68. But I think that all these ideas that we have approached, and this approach we have developed regarding the transnational dimension of 68, this global impact, today, I think that Martin's lecture helped us to analyze how diversity was shaped regarding the different geopolitical, cultural, social contexts. And the fact that 1968 was built by diverse nutrients, and as such, in its varied structural process and cultural projects, and also interpretation, it was shared by the global collective imaginary, which established the claim and the need for change and the affirmation of new social actors. And this has been really shared by different contexts. 68 was a year that symbolizes a process marked by protest and revolts, intense activism, demonstration, and movements. And today we could really follow with the tale how this also had a very strong influence in the way mind changes and theory also faces their development. In fact, I consider that 68 condensed this, the unleashing of different and radical imagination that aimed to set a new course for history. And now, in your analysis, we can really see the place of, let's say, understanding utopias, mobilization to make them come true. And this gives us a very complex, I would say, scenario that requires our attention, The example you brought of this meeting in Jerusalem, it's really a very, I would say, in-depth analysis and also courageous one to understand how different narratives could face and how problems rebel, how reality is more complex than the wishes to find an explanation and also a proposition to solve them. Because I was thinking now, your reference to the difference of ages, of generation between you that are sitting there and we that are sitting here. Regarding this problem, I think that 68 symbolizes a new generation that's not new for you, right? It was for us, we were a new generation that emerged as a leading actor with youth and new cultural codes that, while defining and confronting the existing options, were disputing how to interpret the legacy they were facing, questioning. And as you right said, the new left didn't reach the power, but the old one was already delegitimized. And this is very important, right? 1968 was also, before referring briefly to this opposition, this contradiction, this complexity between 1967 and 1968, that there was a search for another logic of action in all the dimensions, in the ideological, the political, and the cultural spheres. So over there, both the individual and the collective routes to face reality and the challenges gave us a new form of symbolic action, new proposals, including all the concepts that we still face them, like civil society, like new generations, and most important, like the relative presence and meaning of different collective identities, be it economic, be it ethnic, religious, national. So it was a sort of explosion, and this is very important. And for that, I think that the Frankfurt School has been really relevant in bringing, shaking some beliefs that were really deeply rooted in a dogmatism that preceded and accompanied 1968. I would like to stress 2 points that you really developed, I would say, in a very intelligent and in a very courageous way, right? I mean courageous because first, to underscore that not only the common denominator, but also the variety of movements, of expression, of alert, had a long-lasting impact on the interpretation. I think it's a very complex situation. In fact, your analysis focused on Germany, but also the global context, European, and what happened with the Frankfurt School facing non-European reality. explain the complex and always appealing traces of this dialectical imagination, taking the risk of being non-understood or criticized or seen as conservative, instead of trying to locate, right, the problematic in the surrounding scenarios. The problematic connection that occurred between the 1967 Six-Day War and 68 was signified, as you explained, by the success of the West over the USSR. This is, I think, very important, right? And despite the passivity of the United States in the face of the closure of the Strait of Tiran, because it was evident that it was a sort of passivity, and the consequent alteration of the correlation of forces, the Soviet support for Syria as one of the causes of the war would translate into a complete redesign of this strategy, bringing really new challenges to the thought, how to approach it. And I much appreciate how you build what Volkov called a cultural code, right? A cultural code means that anti-imperialism, anti-West, anti-colonialism, anarchist, Marxist, and alternative, right, that all work together, gave a very difficult situation, I would say, to most of the progressive thought and camp that was taking on the Jewish. Let us remind together, of course, with your analysis and the Frankfurt School thought, what did it mean to start converting the victim in victimizer, right? So this was a very difficult situation that brought a virtual broke, right? And didn't help to analyze the different potential solutions. I think also that a person like you, like an cultural historian that has followed all the place of utopia, right, of dialectical imagination, to have to confront to the idea that the promises of emancipation were not clearly accurate to reality. And this is somehow where we stand here. You brought Latin America and all the experiences, of course, going out from Europe, Africa, Asia. I was listening now to you and thinking of Traverso's interpretation and his probably, I would say, difficult interpretation of the end of Jewish modernity, but something you can find there. So I think that we want to share with all of you. I will not continue now. I want to have your questions, but we'll share with all of you that you are registered some of the work that we can contribute to help, because as Karla Valverde really reminded me now, this conference takes place amidst the doctorate and magister colloquiums, and also the development of this area for students of undergraduate students. So let us really, after you open this, I would say, magnificent challenge of a theory that search for the potentiality of reality. I mean, how you compare what it is, the present, with what could be. So explaining and analyzing with this story offers us really a broad understanding of complexity of reality. So having said so, I would like to open. You may ask, you may reflect in Spanish if you prefer. We may open now the set of questions of observations that you may raise. So let me ask you, please, if there are some comments, questions, observation, etc., etc. Yes?
Well, everybody needs to think a little bit about it. I have my questions already. Can I do that? Okay. Should I first try so that everybody follows? Así. Gracias a ustedes, porque no me había dado cuenta. Well, I don't want to make a commentary, but I think that what is interesting for me is the idea of the unmastered past that has happened between 1968 until 2023. But let's say we moved from, I think that the very good example of how intellectual activism and progressive thinkers moved was in 1968 in France. Sartre was the guide, and he was wrong by all means. So the substitution of Sartre was Foucault, of course, and some of the Foucaultian possibilities, among them Amy Allen's critical work, really took over the idea that all these ways in which social struggles were understood, they left class apart and they went to identity politics. And identity politics was 1968 really how all the students that failed and understand how they wanted to prog transformation, social transformation. They, at least in Mexico, all they wanted was more democracy. But at the same time, they were all thinking about Marxism. They were thinking in a very strange way about democracy and Marxism. So it wasn't clear. This meant to me that all the people from 1968 are not that generation. I'm younger, fortunately for me, because I think that all the people from 1968 had the problem of staying in their mind, thinking that 1968 was the highest of the zenith of progressive thinking. And lots of other things started dividing. So my interest in the paper is about the competing narratives that you use. This is a very important historical concept, meaning
because I think we will have.
Okay, sorry. So I'll make my question. No, all I wanted to say is that the really emancipatory leading force came only with feminism, in my opinion. And it was, of course, Amy Allen is, and also Patricia Hill Collins just wrote a book called Intersectionalism as Critical Theory. And she integrates again there Horkheimer and critical theory. But she's a Black thinker. So the idea for me is that only at the very end, this, let's say, the challenge of critical theory has been taken mostly by the feminist critical theorists, Nancy Fraser, Amy Allen, etc. Not the men, and not the theorists that had melancholic ideas about not understanding Adorno, not understanding any post-colonial problems, but also Habermas. I mean, Habermas was not connected to or interested in post-colonial theory or decolonial theory.
Very quick response. Sartre, it's fascinating you mentioned him. Sartre also in 1967 was on the side of Israel, much to the great dismay of his supporters in Palestine and elsewhere. And there's been a lot of work showing how ambivalent he was and how much he went back and forth. But like Marcuse and the other members of the Frankfurt School, he understood from a World War II perspective the threat to the existence of the Jewish people. And despite everything, did not denounce Israel. Now, I like the idea of the feminist, let's say, alternative narrative. So, of course, feminism itself and gender relations, I mean, LGBT issues as well, would make yet another story. And the Frankfurt School initially was, I would say, as deficient as virtually everybody else of their generation in taking it seriously. Marcuse, at the very end of his life, because of his third wife, Erika Sharova Marcuse, did begin to talk about feminism, but only in a very kind of external way. So one can do a very interesting analysis of the either supplementary or perhaps contesting relation between feminism and the Frankfurt School. I think what should come out of this paper is a recognition that heroic narratives, revolutionary narratives, need to be called into question. Narratives that begin, say, in 1789, worked their way up through 1848 and maybe the Paris Commune, and then, of course, 1917, and then perhaps culminating in 1968. These narratives have to be mixed with other narratives that have different dates. 67 is not the only one. I mean, one can also do a very serious analysis of 1989 to 1991, the collapse of the Soviet Union. How does that figure into the narrative of heroic, you know, somehow failed, but nonetheless still, we might say, kinds of revolutions that will be somehow realized in the future. 1989 takes us in a very different direction. So I think that's, you know, if you take anything from this lecture, it's the idea that we need to think complexly, you know, complexly with a much less singular narrative.
Not Megan, plural. I mean, not narratives.
No meta-narrative.
Yes.
I mean, there are lots of little narratives. I mean, I'll talk a little bit about this in the lecture on Thursday on the judgment of history. It also relates to the idea, is there possibility of a single meta-narrative, or how do we avoid narratives of decline, or, you know, there are various kinds of meta-narratives that are out there that we sometimes buy into, but we have to be aware of their problems.
Probably still the legacy of the 19th century, right?
In many ways, true.
Yes, please, we have some questions. Yes.
Well, Dr. Jay, thank you very much for your excellent comments. So, yes, thank you for your conference. It's an excellent exercise in historical reflection. It's a very rich proposition to the center 1968. Thank you for that also. Well, I think that we have to read very carefully your paper. I hope to have the time later to do so. But for the moment, I would like to say that I have some worries about the points you have made. One of them is it's a preoccupation about how do you explain the option from feminist and decolonial discourses to establish their discourses in the post-structuralist critical theories and not in the Frankfurt School tradition. I think that we have there a very curious turn in the intellectual history of our times. That's one question. And the other question is how to recover, how to establish a link with the Frankfurt School thinking in terms of the second Frankfurt School developments, mostly Habermas, about the utopian potential of enlightenment. I have a worry about the future. We have to think about the future and not only about the past. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not sure I've understood fully the question, but I would say, first of all, that the importance of post-colonial and post-structuralist thought as a kind of, we might say, intellectual constellation with the Frankfurt School on the outside has to be taken very seriously. I mean, I'm not one of those people who thinks the Frankfurt School gets it right, the French thinkers get it wrong, and that we ought to basically, defend the Enlightenment against nihilism or against whatever caricatured version of the post-structuralist alternative is sometimes made. What I would say is that the Frankfurt School does make us a little less quick to establish an emancipatory implication drawn from the way in which post-colonial and post-structuralist thought merged, simply because it became too quickly associated with a kind of knee-jerk anti-Eurocentrism, a knee-jerk hostility to the Enlightenment, a knee-jerk hostility to traditional master discourses. And I think it's a mistake to go back to them as if they were innocent without being implicated in the dark side of the dialectic of enlightenment, but also to remain dialectical and see the good parts that need to be salvaged. Now, as for post-colonial struggles in general, one has to be very careful. I mean, I'm not a serious student of post-colonial discourse, and I certainly can't pretend to be a student of the histories, intellectual or otherwise, of outside of the European American, let's say, parochial world. What I would say is that it's important to rescue from those discourses and narratives much more than just response to Europe. Post-colonial suggests just by its name that the reference is still colonialism and that they're still fighting the battle to emancipate from colonialism. And in a way, that battle has been more or less won. I mean, there's still lots of cultural and economic, but it's important to regain a kind of confidence that from the indigenous traditions of countries that were once colonized, either literally or perhaps tacitly, from those traditions, there is a resource that needs to be tapped, that is not simply in reference to Europe, not simply in response to Europe, but needs to have its own, let's say, dignity recognized. One thing that I've noticed in the past few years is the idea of critical theory has been expanded to include not only feminism, not only gender studies, not only ecological, but a tremendous, I would say, interest in traditions outside of the West. And the critical theory consortium, which Judith Butler and other people have created, has meant a network of institutions, both journals and centers, and people going back and forth, which takes into account the work being done outside of the West that is not simply to be understood in terms of the reaction to the colonial past. I don't think that's an adequate answer to your question, but I think that gives some support to what I think we're trying to argue.
There, very important.
Well, the future, I'm an historian, so I have trouble enough understanding the past. I think what we need to always, we think about the future, is to recognize it both in terms of continuity and the potential for serious discontinuity. So things go on, things continue, things repeat, things in a kind of cyclical way. What the Germans called us immer gleiche, the ever the same. We think it changed. And capitalism, one of the great, we might say, burdens of capitalism is that on the surface, it's novelty, it's radical change, it's constant movement, but beneath the, let's call it, commodity form or a certain value, all of that remains the same. So there's a kind of repetition which is deeper than the simple change. But there are also possibilities for what we might call ruptures, breaks, unexpected, new departures. And history is very curious. It can have a sense of inevitability and a limiting of possibility to what has already happened. But as Koselleck famously argued, the horizon of expectation in the future is not based as much on the horizon of experience in the past. And so we have a chance for what we might call either unexpected or sometimes planned innovations. So just on the level of technology, which of course is one of the great motors, but not sufficiently determinant, one of the great motors of change. In the past 3 or 4 years, artificial intelligence has emerged as a kind of new frontier, which has created on the part of some people a sense of a rupture that is as great as the Industrial Revolution. I mean, an incredible potential for change, which we are now both hopeful but also anxious about. And we don't know where it's going to go. 10 years ago, people only very, very vaguely saw it on the horizon. So this kind of technological change could, in fact, create something radically new, for good or for ill. So I think the future has always, I won't see as much of it as you will, but the future has a lot of surprises still in store for us.
Here we have another question, I think.
Thank you, Martin.
Just a sense of humor that if Marcus arrives to Jerusalem now, he would discover that prophecy. Oh, sorry, prophecy was there and stopped to be there. Please.
Hay una pregunta más, ahorita te doy la palabra. Martin, I'm very interested in this point of view you introduced about when you said the underdevelopment countries now called Global South. It's only like a new way, a new discourse, or can you explain us a little more about this idea? And if you want, we can hear your question and we can have both.
Well, it's always seemed to me a problem for our larger global understanding to have the terminology essentially Eurocentric. So Europe is the first world, and then communism the second, and then the so-called third world. We don't use that terminology very much anymore. And so suddenly North and South became the distinguishing, opposition, which also is basically, I'm not sure if the global South exists as unity. I mean, is Singapore the same as Sri Lanka? Is Australia the same as South Africa? I mean, it's kind of crazy. And Mexico, I mean, it's fascinating. People ask me, am I going to the global South? And, this is North America. So there's something obviously arbitrary in those definitions. And they become shorthand definitions, usually projected from the outside, projected from, the center. And it's a kind of way to create an other, which can be an other that is seen as inferior or as redemptively superior, as a place from which salvation will come. And this, of course, is what I was arguing against, that in the 1960s and 70s, often countries that were underdeveloped or pre-cap or whatever kind of word you want to use, third world countries, were seen as the source of some sort of political genius which was yet to be unlocked. And that if the revolution were to come, say in Vietnam, this would be, somehow an innovation in Cuba. Else, this would somehow be an inspiration for the rest of the world. We now don't think of the global South, I think, as having much of that left anymore. That the sad stories of the Arab Spring, for example, where a figure like, al-Assad is now back in favor after the failure of the slaughter of thousands, if not millions of Syrians. I mean, it's very hard to have any sort of confidence in that. And there are other examples in Latin America that we could talk about at great length, Venezuela, Cuba, and so forth. So I think that's where this terminology is clumsy and usually, suggests the domination of the other who is describing from afar the term that is being the unmarked term and the marked term.
Thank you.
Question, right? We have to finish.
I have a very specific question in terms of the critique you make to the Frankfurt School in front of this series of political events. I just want to make sure I understood correctly. Do you speak of a political deficit in the Frankfurt School in terms of concrete political action, like going to, with the people? or maybe establishing a concrete political stand on certain struggles or political issues? And if that's so, do you think it is feasible then, all this, I mean, not all this, specifically the theory of communicative action, or maybe the theory of recognition? And that.
So if I've understood the question, this is always a perennial problem in any study of the Frankfurt School, the importance of the unity of theory and practice, the difficulty of finding a radical practice that would somehow realize the critical theory. And I mentioned the strategy of hibernation. This is the phrase that Habermas coined, slightly ironically, saying, well, they're going to wait. They're going to hold their fire. They're not going to be involved in political actions now. And this was especially important in 1968, 69, when in Germany there were students who said, well, you guys were radical. What's happening? Why are you not supporting us? We're doing the real acting. Why are you not? Now, it turns out that the second generation of the Frankfurt School, and in particular Jürgen Habermas, were throughout his career, and he's still, of course, alive and still very much active intellectually, but also politically active. So, there's no intellectual in the 20th century, maybe Sartre, but no intellectual in the 20th and 21st century who's been as politically engaged as Jürgen Habermas.
Right.
I mean, sometimes right, sometimes wrong. You can argue with it, but even today, he writes about the Ukraine war. I mean, he's not in any way afraid of mixing it up with other political commentators, and in a way extrapolating from his theory. So it's not as if it's just like Noam Chomsky, who doesn't connect his linguistics to his politics. Habermas does that. So this shows that the Frankfurt School has the capacity to change, and that the philosophy of, let's say, hibernation, or the political inactivism of hibernation, is not the only lesson you could learn. Critical theory is not a unified philosophy or school, and that's what makes it, in a way, so alive. I mean, it's had generations, it's had geographical dispersion, it's had internal disputes. One can pit Benjamin and Adorno against Habermas and Honneth. It's possible, to have these really internal debates. So there's no one lesson you can get out of it. And I think it's interesting, partly because it responds to the historical challenges of the day. So 68, 69, into the early 70s, one moment. Our moment is very different. And, that's why I think it still has, it's not a monument itself. It's not a tombstone. It's not an end. It's something that should spur, thinking about the future rather than simply reminiscing about the failures of the past.
Okay, so first, jóvenes, queridísimos jóvenes, agradecemos mucho su presencia. Perdón. Vamos a despedirnos, vamos a cerrar y luego seguimos platicando. Muchas gracias a Martin J. I really appreciate very much. We admire your presence. And the best way to say thank you is just to offer you a rain check of a future contribution between the UAM and the UNAM, and have you again very soon here. Probably we may think of a seminar, right? That would be really very good. And well, thank you. Gracias a todos ustedes realmente. Y levantamos la sesión. ¿Cómo? No te oigo.